The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council had never been so quiet. 700 delegates sat in concentric rings of polished obsidian tiers, their bioluminescent sigils dimmed to the lowest ceremonial setting. At the center podium stood High Arbiter Zelvin Karath, a Valori elder whose 3 sets of eyes each reflected a different color of starlight. He had presided over extinction hearings before. He knew the weight of what he was about to announce. The subject of today's session: humanity. Species designation: Terran-class carbon life form. Homeworld: third orbital body of a yellow dwarf star, Sol system, outer rim. Threat classification: Omega provisional. The last 3 words were the kind that made lesser species request a recess. After 17 cycles of deliberation, Zelvin said, his voice carried by harmonic resonators to every corner of the hall, the Galactic Council finds that the Terran species represents an unquantifiable variable in the stability index of the known spiral. Their technological progression curve deviates from every predictive model we have applied. Their emotional volatility index exceeds safe parameters. Their capacity for both coordinated destruction and irrational cooperation presents a dual paradox our analysts cannot resolve. A murmur spread through the hall. Ambassador Drivek Olaz of the Saran Collective leaned forward in his seat, his gill slits flaring with barely concealed excitement. He had been pushing for this outcome for cycles. The Council therefore enacts Edict 79 Kale, Zelvin continued. The Sol system shall be designated a quarantine zone, effective at the next rotation of the Galactic Standard Clock. A cordon of Sentinel drones, 312 units, will be deployed to enforce a hard boundary at the outer edge of the system's Oort cloud. No Terran vessel shall cross. No outside communication shall penetrate inward. The quarantine shall remain in effect for a period no shorter than 400 standard cycles, during which the Council will monitor internal Terran development remotely. He paused. If, during that period, the Terrans achieve self-annihilation, as our models suggest is most probable at a rate of 91.7%, the system will be catalogued and opened for resource survey. If they stabilize, the Council will reconvene. The vote passed with 491 in favor, 12 abstentions, and only 3 dissenting voices. The dissenting delegates were Councillor Fea Sundrath of the Lirani Federation, the ancient machine consciousness known only as Witness 7, and a young Cathali representative named Oren Vale, who sat in the back row and said nothing aloud but filed a formal objection on record. Nobody paid much attention to Oren Vale's objection at the time. That would later be considered a significant oversight. Far below the station, on the blue-green world spinning in ignorant silence, a woman named Dr. Sable Renford sat at a radio telescope array in the mountains of a continent called Patagonia and listened to a very strange kind of static that had started exactly 48 hours ago. She had 3 degrees, 2 cold cups of coffee, and a crawling feeling at the back of her neck that would not go away. She rewound the signal for the 43rd time. The static was not random. It had a pattern. And embedded deep in that pattern, encoded in a frequency no natural phenomenon could produce, were coordinates. Sable Renford stared at her screen for a long time. Then she picked up a satellite phone and called a man named Colonel Dex Calloway, who commanded a classified aerospace research program that officially did not exist, and said 6 words that changed everything. We have been found. And quarantined. Dex was quiet for 3 seconds. That was unusual for him. He was never quiet. How long do we have? He asked. The cordon goes active in approximately 72 hours. Another pause. All right, Dex said. Then, in a voice that was almost too calm, let's get to work. On orbital station Varith 9, Arbiter Zelvin filed the edict and moved on to the next item on the agenda. The humans, he was certain, would never even know the net had been cast around them. He had never been more wrong about anything in a career spanning 3 centuries. Dr. Sable Renford had not slept in 40 hours, and she had never felt more alive. The converted aircraft hangar that served as the unofficial headquarters of Project Antler, a name chosen specifically because it sounded like it had nothing to do with space, was now home to 11 of the most dangerous thinkers on the planet. Sable had called them herself, using a contact list she had compiled over 12 years of academic conferences, classified briefings, and one unforgettable night at a research symposium in Oslo where 3 too many drinks had led to a very candid conversation about non-terrestrial radio signals. They had all come. No one had hesitated. Colonel Dex Calloway, 44, lean and weather-beaten, with the perpetual expression of a man reading a tactical map nobody else could see. Propulsion specialist Dr. Imara Solis, whose work on ion plasma hybridization had been rejected by every major journal before Dex's program had quietly recruited her. Theoretical physicist Yusuf Tenma, who communicated primarily through dense notation and had once corrected a Nobel laureate's math on a napkin at dinner. Xenolinguist Priya Hallcourt, whose ability to decode signal structure bordered on the unsettling. Engineer Rook Vassaran, the youngest of the group at 29, who had built his first functioning rocket engine at 16 and had been watched by 3 governments ever since. And 6 others, each brilliant in a different, sharp-edged way. The signal Sable had decoded was, on its surface, a boundary marker. Think of a fence post driven into the electromagnetic spectrum broadcasting. You are here and you will go no further. The coordinates described a spherical shell roughly at the heliopause, the outer edge of the sun's influence, and the mathematical structure of the transmission was sophisticated enough that Priya had gone pale when she finished parsing it. This is not a warning, Priya said, setting down her tablet. Not exactly. It is a verdict. Explain, Dex said. The encoding structure includes what I can only describe as a legal timestamp, a date mark, and a duration code. Whatever species sent this, they have quarantined us. Formally. The way you quarantine a contagion. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Rook Vassaran said, so we need to get out before the cage door closes. It was exactly that simple and exactly that impossible. The constraint was brutal. 72 hours minus what they had already burned through, to either punch something through the outer boundary before the Sentinel drones activated, or accept that humanity would be imprisoned inside its own solar system for what the duration code translated to as roughly 400 years. Dex had laid out the assets available to them. Project Antler had, in strict secrecy, developed a family of deep space probes using Imara's hybridized propulsion system. They were not fast by any galactic standard, but they were fast by human ones. The furthest developed unit, designated Reach 7, was sitting in a high Earth orbit, nominally listed as a communications relay satellite in the public registry. It had never been a communications relay satellite. Reach 7 can hit the heliopause in approximately 60 hours at maximum thrust, Imara said, her voice precise and unhurried in the way it always was when the stakes were highest. Assuming we burn every gram of reserve propellant, accept total loss of the vehicle, and solve about 14 navigation problems we have not solved yet. Start solving, Dex said. Yusuf had already moved to the whiteboard. The notation that began to appear there was bewildering to most people in the room, but Sable watched it with the focused attention of someone following a musical score. She could hear what he was building. A slingshot trajectory. Layered gravitational assists. A burn sequence that would be, by conventional physics standards, borderline reckless. By human standards, it was exactly what they needed. While Yusuf calculated and Imara ran thrust simulations, Priya worked on a different problem. If Reach 7 made it through the boundary, it needed to say something. Not just transmit noise. It needed to broadcast a message that whoever operated those Sentinel drones would have to receive, would have to process, and, most critically, would have to report upward to whatever authority had ordered the quarantine. What do you say to people who just decided you weren't worth keeping free? Priya murmured, half to herself. Sable set a fresh cup of coffee beside her. The truth, I think. Every version of it. Priya looked up. Their eyes met. Then I'll need everything, Priya said. Everything we are. Art, history, science, music, war, grief, love. I want to write the most complete portrait of a species ever transmitted. And I want it compressed into a signal tight enough to punch through a military cordon. Rook, who had been listening while running cable diagnostics, said quietly, no pressure. Priya smiled for the first time in 2 days. Enormous pressure. That is exactly the point. 61 hours, 30 minutes. 14 unsolved problems. 1 probe. 1 species. Dex Calloway stood at the window of the hangar and looked up at a sky that, for the first time in his life, felt like it had walls. He had spent his career preparing for threats from the outside. He had never imagined the threat would be the boundary itself. He turned back to the room. Let's get to work, he said again. Because there was nothing else to say and everything left to do. The launch of Reach 7 was not celebrated. There was no countdown broadcast, no crowd, no cameras. It was reclassified in the public registry as a routine propulsion test and boosted from its parking orbit at 3:14 in the morning, local Patagonian time, while most of the world slept in ignorance. In the hangar, nobody slept at all. Imara Solis monitored the burn sequence from a workstation that had been running continuously for 2 days, its fans whirring with something that sounded almost like exhaustion. The hybridized ion plasma engine was performing beyond even her most optimistic projections, which she noted in her log with clinical satisfaction and absolutely no display of emotion, because she was saving all of her emotion for when this either worked or didn't. The 14 navigation problems had been reduced to 3. Yusuf Tenma had spent 11 hours at the whiteboard and produced a trajectory document that Rook Vassarin printed, laminated, and taped above the main console with a note that read, "This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Yusuf, upon reading this, had adjusted his glasses and returned to his calculations without comment, which was his version of being deeply moved. Priya Hallcourt's message was finished. She had not slept during any of the time the others were solving propulsion and navigation. She had been writing in a different language entirely, one built not from grammar but from mathematics, from universal constants, from the patterns that any sufficiently advanced intelligence would recognize. Within that mathematical skeleton she had woven everything else. A compressed archive of human history, human science, human music, human war, human failure, and human persistence. She had included recordings of children laughing. She had included the periodic table. She had included a human heartbeat. She had included the trajectory of the first moon landing and the complete genetic sequence of a single flower. She had included, deliberately and without apology, recordings of every major human conflict of the past 2 centuries. Why? Dex had asked when she showed him. Because whoever sent that edict thinks they know what we are, Priya said. They think we are a threat. A variable. An unstable element. I want them to see that we already know what we are. We have been documenting our own darkness for as long as we have been documenting anything. We are the species that invented the confession. We are the species that builds memorials to its own worst moments. We know what we contain. The question is whether they are intelligent enough to understand what that means. Dex stared at the archive summary for a long time. Then he said, "Send it." 47 hours after the quarantine edict had been filed in the Galactic Council's archive, and approximately 4 hours before the Sentinel drone cordon was scheduled to go fully active, Reach 7 crossed the termination shock and entered the helio sheath. 19 hours later, running on reserve fuel and thermal management protocols that Rook was patching in real time from the ground, it reached the heliopause. The Sentinel drones were already there. 312 of them, arranged in a spherical mesh of extraordinary precision, each one a dark geometric shape roughly the size of a passenger aircraft, broadcasting on frequencies that Sable's array could now detect clearly. They were active. The cordon was live. Reach 7 hit the boundary at maximum velocity. The drones had been programmed to destroy any Terran vessel attempting to breach. Their targeting systems activated within milliseconds. The order to fire was processed. But Reach 7 was not trying to breach. It was transmitting. Priya had encoded the message on every frequency the Sentinel array used for its own internal communication. It didn't punch through the drones. It spoke to them. And because the drones were automated relay units, sophisticated but ultimately designed to receive and report, they did exactly what their programming required. They received the signal. They logged it. They flagged it as priority unclassified anomalous. And they automatically forwarded it, as per standard protocol, to the nearest Galactic Council monitoring station. In the Patagonian hangar, Sable Renford watched the telemetry readout as Reach 7's final power reserves exhausted themselves. The probe went dark exactly 11 minutes after transmitting. It had done everything asked of it. The room was completely silent. Then Rook Vassarin, who had been awake for 53 consecutive hours, sat down on the floor with his back against the console and said very quietly, "We just knocked on the door of an interstellar government." "More like slid a note under it," Priya said. "What happens now?" Amar asked. Sable Renford looked at the last telemetry ping from Reach 7, a small, stubborn dot of light that had traveled further than any human-built object had ever traveled in that direction, carrying the whole weight of a species behind it. "Now we find out if anyone on the other side knows how to read," she said. Senior analyst Vexa Morin had been assigned to Sol system monitoring duty for what her supervisor had described as a formality posting. The humans were quarantined. The drones were active. The only expected input was the routine stability telemetry the Sentinel array transmitted every standard cycle. What she received instead made her set down her beverage and not pick it up again for 6 hours. The anomalous transmission had been flagged priority unclassified, which was the automated system's way of saying, "I do not know what to do with this." Vexa opened the file expecting a malformed drone diagnostic or perhaps atmospheric interference noise given new designation. What she found was a structured signal of 7.4 teratons in compressed data, transmitted on the Sentinel array's own internal frequency, originating from a mechanical object of Terran construction that had reached the outer boundary of the Sol quarantine zone approximately 1 standard day after the cordon went live. The Terrans had launched a probe. Before the net had even fully closed. Vexa ran the analysis protocol twice because once did not seem sufficient. The probe had burned itself out transmitting. It had made no attempt to pass the cordon. It had simply communicated. The signal, when she began to decompress it, was structured in a mathematical encoding that her translation suite required 4 hours to fully parse. What emerged from that parsing was not what Vexa had expected. She had dealt with pre-contact and early contact species before. Their transmissions were usually simple. Patterns, prime numbers, geometric progressions. The basic vocabulary of minds just discovering they were not alone. This was not that. This was a complete self-portrait. The archive contained what Vexa's translation system classified as historical records spanning approximately 10,000 orbital cycles, scientific documentation across 47 distinct fields of study, cultural artifacts including audio recordings, visual art and structured narrative formats, biological and genetic data, and something that the system flagged as category ambiguous, which upon review Vexa identified as philosophy. The humans had sent their philosophy. Their arguments with themselves. Their recorded debates about the nature of consciousness, the meaning of suffering, the obligations of the powerful toward the powerless. They had sent documents they called constitutions and manifestos and treaties. They had sent records of when those documents had failed. They had sent records of when they had tried again. Vexa worked through the archive methodically, the way she worked through everything, but the methodical pace became increasingly difficult to maintain as she progressed. She was several hours in when she encountered the section she would later describe in her report as the most unusual component of the transmission. It was a direct address. Not mathematical. Not encoded. Written in a language the translation suite had never encountered before, but accompanied by a linguistic key so thorough that Vexa had the complete translation within 40 minutes. The language was called English, and the document was addressed, not to the Council as an institution, not to a species designation, but to whoever was currently reading this. It had been written by a xenolinguist named Priya Halcourt. Vexa read it 3 times. The document began, "You have decided what we are before meeting us. We have also decided what we are and we included the evidence. We invite you to compare your conclusions with ours." It went on. It was not aggressive. It was not pleading. It was something Vexa had no immediate category for in her professional vocabulary, something that sat between scientific paper and personal letter, between argument and invitation. Halcourt had written about human self-awareness with a precision that was almost clinical, and then pivoted into passages of such frank emotional honesty that Vexa found herself checking the translation parameters twice to ensure the rendering was accurate. At one point Halcourt had written, "We are violent because we evolved in scarcity, and we know this, and we have spent the majority of our recorded history arguing about what to do with that knowledge. We have not resolved the argument. We are still having it. We believe the fact that we are still having it matters more than the fact that the argument exists." Vexa sat back in her chair for a long time after finishing. Then she composed her report to the Council and marked it Priority Immediate, which was a classification she had used exactly twice in her 9-cycle career. She included the full archive as an attachment. She also included a personal note, which was not standard protocol and which she filed anyway. "I recommend the Council review this transmission before the next monitoring rotation. Not because it represents a threat. Because it represents something I cannot classify, and in my experience, things we cannot classify are the things most worth understanding." The report arrived at Orbital Station Varith 9 during the Council's standard rest cycle. Councillor Oren Vale, the young Cathali delegate who had been the only dissenting voice no one had listened to, was still awake at his workstation when the priority notification came in. He read Vexa's report in full. Then he read the archive summary. Then he sat in the dark of his office with the lights of 1,000 stars outside his window, thinking about a species that had built memorials to its own worst moments and called it progress. He began to draft a formal motion. Oren Vale had been a member of the Galactic Council for less than 3 cycles. He was considered junior in the extreme, a diplomatic courtesy seat for a species, the Cathali, that had only recently achieved full membership status. He had no committee appointments of significance. He sat in the back row. He was given 2 minutes of speaking time per session as a standard allocation. He filed his formal motion with exactly 22 minutes to spare before the Council's next general session, and the motion was titled, "Immediate Review of Edict 79 Kale, Sol System Quarantine, based on new evidentiary material." The motion required a co-sponsor to proceed. Councillor Faya Sundrath of the Lirani Federation co-sponsored it within 11 minutes of receiving the notification, without being asked, and attached a note that said only, "I have been waiting for a reason." Witness 7, the ancient machine consciousness that had cast the third dissenting vote at the original hearing, filed a supporting statement from its permanent observer post that was exactly 3 sentences long. "I have reviewed the Terran transmission. My predictive modeling has been substantially revised. The Council should be aware that its 91.7% extinction probability estimate was generated using incomplete behavioral datasets." The session opened with Ambassador Drivek Olaz of the Sarayan Collective attempting to table the motion on procedural grounds, which was denied by Arbiter Zelvin on the basis that new evidentiary material from the subject species met the threshold for mandatory review under Galactic Council Charter Article 114, subsection 7. Drivek was not pleased. His gill slits cycled through several colors that Vexa Morin, who had been summoned to present her findings in person, recognized as indicating deep displeasure. Vexa presented for 40 minutes without notes. She walked the council through the transmission structure, the archive contents, the linguistic analysis of Priya Hallcourt's direct address, and her own conclusions. She was methodical. She was precise. And at the end, she said something that was not in her prepared remarks and that she had decided to say anyway. "I have monitored 63 species across my career. I have reviewed the transmission archives of every species currently under quarantine or restricted contact status. I have never encountered a pre-contact civilization that transmitted its own self-critique. The Terrans did not send us their successes. They sent us their entire record, including every documented failure, and they framed that record as evidence of their fitness for contact. I believe this reflects a cognitive framework our models did not account for." Silence. High Arbiter Zelvin, to his credit, did not dismiss this. He was old, and he had learned that the most dangerous thing an old mind could do was mistake certainty for wisdom. "Elaborate," he said. "Every predictive model we applied to the Terrans was built on the assumption that a species which acknowledges its own destructive potential is more likely to act on it. The Terrans appear to operate on an inverse assumption. They believe that acknowledgement is the mechanism of restraint. That self-awareness functions as a brake, not an accelerant. That assumption has no precedent in our records," Drivek interjected. "No," Vexa agreed. "They may be the precedent." The chamber erupted. It took Arbiter Zelvin several minutes to restore order. When he did, Oren Vale was recognized for his full speaking allocation, expanded by chair's discretion to 15 minutes, which was unheard of for a junior delegate. Oren stood at the central podium. He was young by any species standard, with the faintly luminescent skin that Cathali had in their early adulthood, and he spoke with the quiet intensity of someone who had been thinking about what he wanted to say for a very long time. "We quarantined them because we were afraid of what they might do to us," he said. "I want the Council to consider a different question. Not what they might do to us, but what we have already done to them." He let that sit for a moment. "We observed them for cycles. We analyzed them. We deliberated for 17 cycles in this chamber about their fate. And in all of that time, across all of those deliberations, we never once contacted them. We never introduced ourselves. We never offered them any information about the galaxy they live in. We made a decision about their fitness for existence in our community without ever speaking to them." He paused. "And yet, within 72 hours of learning they were being quarantined, a thing they were not supposed to know, they built and launched a probe that reached the cordon boundary, and instead of attempting to breach it, they transmitted a complete self-portrait and asked us to compare their conclusions about themselves with ours." He looked around the chamber. "That is not the behavior of a threat. That is the behavior of a species asking to be known." The chamber was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet at the original hearing. The earlier silence had been administrative, procedural. This was something else. This was the sound of a very large number of very intelligent beings reconsidering something they had been certain about. Ambassador Drivek Olaz broke the silence with a sharp, "Their probe breached our restricted monitoring frequency. That is a hostile act." Oren did not look away from him. "They used the only frequency that would get through. They used our own communication channel. Because they are very good at working with what they have." Faya Sundrath said from her seat, "Motion to form an emergency review committee. Full access to Analyst Morin's archive materials. Suspension of the extinction probability weighting in the quarantine maintenance protocol pending review." The vote on the motion was 401 in favor. Drivek Olaz voted against it and immediately filed a counter-motion that everyone knew would fail. In the Sol system, behind a cordon of 312 Sentinel drones, in a mountain hangar in Patagonia, Dr. Sable Renford's monitoring array detected a shift in the Sentinel drone broadcast frequency. It was subtle. It was brief. But it was there. She woke Priya Hallcourt, who was asleep on a cot behind the main console. Something changed, Sable said. Priya blinked. Changed how? The drones are still active. But the broadcast pattern shifted. Like they received a new instruction set. She paused. Not deactivation. Something else. Stand by, Priya said slowly. Sable nodded. They put us on standby. It was not freedom. It was not contact. But it was not silence either. It was the pause before a door opens. The Emergency Review Committee met for 9 consecutive days of standard council time, which was a pace that would have been considered reckless by ordinary deliberative standards and which Oren Vale had specifically designed by structuring his motion to require it. He had learned early in his posting that the council moved quickly only when the procedural framework gave it no alternative. He had built that framework with care. The committee consisted of 11 members including Faya Sundrath, Witness 7, 3 senior scientific advisors, analyst Vexa Murin in a formal evidentiary capacity, and Arbiter Zelvin himself, who had taken the unusual step of joining as a non-voting observer. Drivek Olaz had applied for a seat and been denied on conflict of interest grounds, which he had filed a formal objection to, which was being processed at administrative speed, which meant effectively never. The 9 days produced what the committee formally designated as the Revised Terran Assessment, running to 412 pages of technical and philosophical analysis. Witness 7 contributed 107 pages of that alone, which included a complete rerun of the extinction probability model using behavioral data extracted from the Terran Transmission Archive. The revised probability, 34.2%. In species development modeling, that was the difference between a condemned variable and a complicated one. More importantly, the model now included a survivability metric that had not been present in the original assessment, a figure representing the probability that the species would develop sustainable interstellar-compatible civilization within 400 cycles if no external intervention occurred. Original estimate, 8%. Revised estimate, 61%. High Arbiter Zelvin read the revised figures 3 times. He was a being of genuine intellectual honesty, which was rarer in his position than it should have been, and he acknowledged in his private log, later entered into the committee record at his own request, that the original assessment had been conducted under conditions of what he termed methodological overconfidence. It was as close as 3 centuries of institutional authority could come to an apology. The committee's unanimous recommendation: initiate limited first contact. Not a revocation of the quarantine, that required a full council vote and would take time, but an authorized, formal transmission into the Sol system, directed at the humans who had already demonstrated both awareness of the situation and capability for structured communication. The message was drafted by Priya Hallcourt's counterpart, a council xenocommunications specialist named Saren Duvath, a Lirani with impeccable credentials and a reputation for precision that even Faya Sundrath found occasionally exhausting. Saren worked with Priya's linguistic key, the one embedded in the original transmission, and composed a reply in English. It was short. 15 sentences. Saren argued, and Oren agreed, that brevity was the correct register for this moment. Humanity had sent a cathedral. The appropriate first response was not a matching cathedral but a handshake. The message was transmitted through a dedicated communication relay that bypassed the Sentinel drones, because the Council, Oren noted with quiet satisfaction, was now using the human's own logic. Use the channel that will get through. It arrived at Dr. Sable Renford's array at 4:47 in the morning, Patagonian time, 11 days after Reach 7 had gone dark at the boundary. The signal was clean, structured, and utterly unmistakable. Sable stared at it for 2 minutes. Then she walked to the back of the hangar, where Priya Hallcourt was asleep on her cot, and shook her gently by the shoulder. Priya. Priya sat up immediately, the way people do when they have trained themselves to wake fast. What? We have a reply. The whole team assembled at the main console in various states of undress and disorientation, coffee being distributed with the urgency of a medical intervention. Priya sat in the translation chair and worked through the message with the same focused intensity she had brought to every hour of the past 2 weeks. Then she leaned back and she was quiet for a long time. What does it say? Dex asked. Priya read it aloud. The message acknowledged receipt of the Terran transmission. It identified itself as originating from the Galactic Council Review Committee. It confirmed that the quarantine remained formally in effect pending a full council vote. It noted that the vote had been scheduled. It stated that the transmission sent by the humans had been received and reviewed by the committee in full. And then in the final 3 sentences it said, "Your document contained a question. You asked us to compare our conclusions about your species with your own. We have begun that comparison. Will take time, but it has begun." Rook Vassarin sat very still with his coffee halfway to his mouth. Imara Solis ran a hand over her face. Yusuf Tenma wrote something in his notebook and underlined it twice. Dex Calloway stood at the back of the group with his arms crossed, and the expression on his face was not triumph. It was something more complicated. The expression of a person who had spent a career preparing for threats and had just discovered that the most effective thing he had ever done was make sure a poet was in the room. He looked at Priya. "You said the truth was the right message," he said. "I thought it was," she said. "I was not certain." "You were right." Priya looked at the screen at the translated words still glowing there. "We were right," she said. "All of us." Outside the hangar, the Patagonian dawn was beginning. The sky over the mountains was going from black to the precise blue that exists only in the minutes before the sun arrives, when night has not yet conceded but light has already won. Sable Renford stepped outside and tipped her head back and looked at the stars, which were still visible. The cordon was still up. The drones were still there. The quarantine was still formally in effect. But someone on the other side had written back. And they had said, "It has begun." The full council session was scheduled for what the Galactic Standard Calendar designated as the 44th day following the initial quarantine enactment, which, by the coincidence of orbital mechanics that nobody had planned and everyone later remarked upon, was also the day that Earth completed exactly 1/4 of its annual revolution around the Sun from the date of Sable Renford's first detection of the boundary signal. Humans would have called it a season's turn. The chamber held all 700 delegates. The gallery, which was normally empty except for registered observers, had been opened by special session order and was filled with representatives from 40 species who held observer-only council status, including several whose civilizations had emerged from quarantine protocols in previous centuries and who had made the journey to the station specifically for this vote. Ambassador Drivek Olaz of the Sarayan Collective had not withdrawn his countermotion. He was allowed to present it. He presented it for 20 minutes with the professional thoroughness of someone who knew he had lost and intended to lose on the record correctly so that the record would show he had been thorough. Whatever his politics, Drivek was not sloppy. His argument: the Terrans had violated the Sentinel drone communication frequency. They had demonstrated capability for extraterrestrial propulsion beyond what the original assessment had attributed to them. They were unpredictable. The quarantine should be maintained for the original duration. Oren Vale was given 30 minutes. He used 12. He presented the committee's revised figures. He presented Witness 7's remodeled probability analysis. He presented Saren Duvatha's linguistic breakdown of Priya Hallcourt's transmission, which Saren had annotated with a precision that had made even Drivek read twice. And then he presented one last thing, which he had requested from Vexa Murin and which she had provided with a note that said, "This is the part one keep returning to." It was a single audio clip from the Terran archive. Not a scientific recording. Not a historical document. A piece of music. Approximately 4 minutes in duration. It had been composed by a human who had lived 2 centuries prior to current time and who, the archive notes indicated, had composed it while progressively losing the ability to hear it. The archive notes described this as one of the most famous facts about the piece, that its creator had made it in the condition of its primary intended absence. Oren played it in the council chamber. He said nothing while it played. When it finished, the chamber was silent for 11 seconds. Vexa Murin timed it from her seat in the evidentiary section. Then Oren said, "I am not arguing that the Terrans are without danger. I am arguing that they are the kind of dangerous that builds things in the dark and leaves them for the light. The kind of dangerous that names its own worst tendencies and argues with them in public. The kind of dangerous that sends a probe to the edge of a prison it did not know about and, instead of trying to break the bars, asks to be understood." He paused. "We call ourselves the Galactic Council. I am asking the Council to decide what that word means." The vote was called immediately following, which was itself unusual. The normal procedure allowed for 2 additional debate periods. High Arbiter Zelvin waived them on his own authority, which was within his power and which he would later describe as the single clearest decision he had made in 3 centuries. The motion before the Council: revocation of Edict 79 Kale, replacement with a provisional first contact protocol for the Sol system, and the assignment of a contact delegation to be dispatched to the boundary within one standard cycle. The vote: 544 in favor, 140 against, 16 abstentions. Drivek Olaz voted against. He also, in the days that followed, quietly requested the full Terran archive from the committee files for his own review. He told no one. Vexamurin noticed the access log and noted it in her personal journal without comment. The Sentinel drones received the stand-down order at Galactic Standard Time 14 hours 33 minutes and 7 seconds. In Patagonia, at 7:18 in the morning, Sable Renford's monitoring array went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not the silence of a signal blocked. The silence of a signal no longer needed. She checked the frequency. Then checked again. The drones were in standby mode. Not deactivation. The quarantine revocation was a formal process that would take weeks to fully implement. But the cordon was no longer active. The frequency that had broadcast that hard boundary for 44 days was now carrying something different. An open channel. Priya Hallcourt was already at her station. She had barely left it in 6 weeks. She saw the frequency shift before Sable said anything, and she was already running the analysis by the time Dex walked in with 2 cups of coffee at 7:21. They opened it, Priya said. Dex set 1 cup in front of her. Stood very still. The whole cordon? Not fully. But the channel is open. Bidirectional. She turned to look at him. They want to talk. The team assembled for what Amara Solis later described as the most disorganized celebration she had ever witnessed, which involved someone crying, someone laughing about crying, Yusuf Tenma writing furiously in his notebook, Rook Vassarin doing a single pull-up on a structural beam for no clear reason, and Dex Calloway standing in the middle of all of it looking like a man who had run a very long race and had only now fully registered that he had finished. Sable composed the reply to the open channel. She kept it simple. She had been many things over the past 6 weeks: scientist, strategist, decoder, first listener. Right now she was just a person writing to strangers who had decided they wanted to know her species. She wrote, "We received your channel. We are here. We have been here the whole time. We are glad you are ready to talk. So are we. We have a great deal to tell you. We also want to hear everything. Please start anywhere." She sent it. The reply came in 47 minutes, fast by any diplomatic standard, which meant someone on the other side had been waiting. It said, "We will start at the beginning. So will you. Between us we will find where the 2 beginnings connect." In the council chamber, Oren Vale received the transmission confirmation on his personal communicator and read it in the quiet of his office. Outside his window 1,000 stars. One of them, very small, very ordinary, very yellow, hosted a world where people were currently arguing about what to have for breakfast and whether the news was worth watching and how to apologize to someone they had hurt and what music to listen to on the way to work. He thought about the music that had played in the chamber. He thought about a composer who had made something beautiful in the condition of its primary intended absence. He thought that was probably the most important thing the humans had said, even if they had not meant it as a statement. They made things in the dark. They left them for the light. He filed his post-session report, marked the contact protocol as initiated, and for the first time in 44 days went to sleep before midnight. Somewhere at the edge of a solar system that was no longer a cage, the first human-built probe ever to speak to the stars drifted cold and dark and finished, having done exactly what it was made to do. Behind it, a species was already building the next one,